Judah had seen kings who sought the favor of God and kings who led the people into sin, but none left a shadow as dark as Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, who ascended the throne at only 12 years of age, circa 697 BCE after the death of his father, inheriting not just a kingdom, but the immense responsibility of carrying forward the Davidic line in Jerusalem at a time when the Assyrian Empire dominated the Near East and threatened the survival of small states like Judah. While Hezekiah had been celebrated for his faithfulness to Yahweh, his reforms, and his courage in resisting Assyria, Manasseh would quickly reverse his father's work, rebuilding high places in the hills, erecting altars to Baal and Asherah, introducing worship of the host of heaven even within the temple courts, consulting mediums and spiritists, and committing acts so abhorrent as child sacrifice in the Valley of Ben Hinnom that the chroniclers later declared he did more evil than all the nations that the Lord had destroyed before Israel. Yet his reign of 55 years would also see political skill, survival under Assyrian dominance, and a complex moment of repentance following his captivity in Babylon. His story is one of terror and intrigue, of spiritual corruption and political maneuvering, of a young boy who became the darkest king of Judah, shaping a generation of Israelites and leaving a legacy that would echo through the centuries, offering both a cautionary tale of the consequences of sin and an extraordinary example of divine mercy when even the most sinful ruler sought redemption. The boy who became king. Manasseh became king of Judah at the age of 12 following the death of his father, King Hezekiah, who had been celebrated for his faithfulness to Yahweh and his reform of the temple worship in Jerusalem. Circa 697 BCE, a young boy found himself on the throne of a kingdom that had already survived the Assyrian threat under Hezekiah's leadership. While Hezekiah had centralized worship and destroyed the high places of pagan gods, Manasseh immediately reversed those reforms, rebuilding altars for Baal and Asherah in the hills and countryside of Judah. According to biblical records, he even erected altars to the host of heaven within the courts of the temple itself, a shocking desecration that defiled the sacred spaces his father had purified. These early acts set the tone for a reign that would be remembered not for military or political prowess, but for profound spiritual rebellion. Contemporary scholars note that the speed with which Manasseh reintroduced idolatry suggests he had supporters in Judah's priesthood and among influential families who either feared him or shared his worldview. Beyond the religious defiance, Manasseh's actions were entwined with political strategy. Judah at the time existed under the shadow of the Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Levant and demanded tribute and loyalty from smaller states. By embracing the cults and religious practices common in Assyria, including astral worship and syncretistic rituals, Manasseh may have been attempting to curry favor with his powerful neighbors. However, these outward political maneuvers disguised inner corruption that would horrify future generations. The biblical texts emphasize that Manasseh not only tolerated idolatry, but actively encouraged it among his people, leading Judah to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. This judgment reflects a theological lens, but also hints at the social disorientation and fear that his rule generated. One of the most chilling aspects of Manasseh's early reign was his engagement with occult practices. Historical and biblical accounts describe him as consulting mediums, spiritists, and necromancers, seeking guidance from the unseen rather than from the God of Israel. He went so far as to practice child sacrifice in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, an act so extreme it became synonymous in later Jewish tradition with the idea of hell and divine judgment. These actions would not have gone unnoticed by the citizens of Jerusalem. Prophets, priests, and officials within the court must have witnessed these rituals. Yet their ability to oppose the king was limited by his youth, his authority as a Davidic monarch, and the fear inspired by his brutality. Manasseh's cruelty behind closed doors would set a precedent for unchecked royal power intertwined with spiritual corruption. Historians have also noted that Manasseh's idolatry was not merely personal indulgence, but involved systemic changes to Judah's religious landscape. High places that had been destroyed under Hezekiah were restored and often expanded, becoming centers of worship for multiple deities. This was likely a calculated effort to consolidate power and wealth within the kingdom, as controlling religious centers meant controlling the collection of tithes and offerings. In doing so, Manasseh blurred the line between political authority and religious influence, ensuring that loyalty to him was enforced not only by soldiers and officials, but also through coerced participation in his cultic activities. These reforms reveal a king adept at using fear and religious obligation to maintain control over a population that might have been otherwise resistant to his rule. The psychological dimension of Manasseh's rule cannot be ignored. A young king, ascending to power at 12, surrounded by older advisors and palace intrigue, may have been influenced by insecurity and ambition, channeling these emotions into acts of cruelty and domination. Yet the biblical narrative portrays him as calculating and unapologetic, fully aware of the moral and spiritual implications of his actions. Chroniclers remark that his reign led the people to sin in the sight of the Lord, reflecting both the king's influence and the communal consequences of his decisions. Even Assyrian records, which note Manasseh's tribute to their empire, imply that his political acumen was matched by moral compromise, as the alliances he pursued often required submission to foreign gods and cultural practices antithetical to Israelite identity. By the end of his early years on the throne, Manasseh had firmly established his legacy as Judah's darkest king. While externally he maintained the appearances of Davidic rule and political diplomacy, internally the kingdom was transformed into a landscape of spiritual decay and fear. Historians suggest that his long reign, though providing stability against external threats, entrenched idolatry and set the stage for future judgment against Judah. The boy who became king had matured into a ruler whose actions would be remembered for generations as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power, the seduction of idolatry, and the horrors that could be committed behind the closed doors of a royal palace. Politics, Assyria, and the shadow over Judah. Manasseh's reign unfolded in a world dominated by the Assyrian Empire, which, by the late 7th century BCE, had established itself as the preeminent power in the ancient Near East. Assyria's armies had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and deported tens of thousands of its people, leaving Judah as a small vassal state in the empire's western provinces. Circa 697 BCE to 642 BCE, Manasseh navigated the dangerous waters of imperial politics, seeking to protect his young kingdom while asserting his own authority. The Assyrian kings, including Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, demanded tribute and loyalty from Judah, and the biblical accounts suggest that Manasseh complied with their demands. Yet, beneath the surface of political submission lay a complex relationship between a king trying to secure his throne, a people increasingly drawn into idolatry, and the looming presence of a foreign empire that tolerated little dissent. Evidence for Manasseh's political maneuvering is found not only in the biblical texts, but also in Assyrian inscriptions. The Esarhaddon prism, housed in the British Museum, lists Manasseh among the Western kings who submitted to the Assyrian ruler, paid tribute, and assisted in imperial projects. These inscriptions describe kings transporting materials for the construction of palaces and monuments in Nineveh, showing that Judah, under Manasseh, was part of a vast network of vassal states bound by military and economic obligations. Some historians suggest that Manasseh's compliance was motivated not by devotion to Assyria, but by the practical need to protect Jerusalem from invasion and destruction. By outwardly supporting the empire and adopting religious practices compatible with Assyrian cosmology, including astral worship, Manasseh sought to placate the empire while consolidating his own power at home. Assyria's influence in Judah extended beyond politics and economics. It also shaped culture and religion. Astral cults, including worship of the sun, moon, and stars, were prominent in Assyria and the surrounding region, and Manasseh appears to have adopted these practices within Jerusalem itself. He established altars to the host of heaven in the very courts of the temple, directly challenging the reforms of his father Hezekiah, who had centralized worship of Yahweh. By promoting these cults, Manasseh not only aligned Judah with the dominant power of the region, but also entrenched a system of syncretistic worship that undermined the covenant identity of the people. For many of Judah's priests and citizens, this must have been bewildering and terrifying, as the sacred spaces they had once revered were now filled with symbols of foreign gods and occult practices. In addition to these political and religious adaptations, Manasseh's internal governance relied on a combination of fear, coercion, and religious authority. High places that Hezekiah had destroyed were rebuilt and expanded under Manasseh, serving as centers of worship and control. These centers allowed the king to collect tithes and offerings from a population required to participate in idolatrous rituals, effectively linking economic power with spiritual manipulation. The chroniclers emphasize that the people followed entirely the abominations of the nations, reflecting how Manasseh's policies created both widespread moral corruption and systemic control. By intertwining political authority with religious practice, Manasseh ensured that opposition within the kingdom would be difficult, if not impossible, to organize. The king's relationship with prophecy and divination further complicated Judah's spiritual landscape. Biblical accounts describe Manasseh consulting mediums, necromancers, and spiritists, seeking knowledge of the future and guidance in matters of state from sources forbidden by the law of Moses. He practiced child sacrifice in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, an act that horrified observers and would later become symbolic of Judah's ultimate judgment. These secret and public rituals reveal a ruler obsessed with power and control, unrestrained by moral or religious norms. Prophets and religious leaders in Jerusalem likely watched in fear and despair as their warnings went unheeded, aware that Manasseh's actions endangered the covenant relationship between God and the people. Yet despite his spiritual corruption, Manasseh's reign was marked by political stability, at least externally. Judah avoided the fate of Israel and maintained its borders, likely due to Manasseh's compliance with Assyrian demands and his strategic alliances. This paradox, external stability alongside internal moral decay, is central to understanding his legacy. Scholars have suggested that Manasseh's long reign allowed the kingdom to survive imperial pressures, but at a terrible cost. A generation of Judahites grew up under a king whose policies normalized idolatry, occultism, and the abuse of power. The tension between political prudence and spiritual catastrophe defined his rule, leaving historians and theologians alike to wrestle with the complex character of this longest reigning king. Manasseh's alliance with Assyria, his adoption of foreign religious practices, and his ruthless enforcement of idolatry created a kingdom deeply compromised in both faith and identity. The biblical writers condemned his reign as the darkest of Judah's monarchy, a period in which the people were seduced into abandoning the covenant of their ancestors. Yet the historical evidence also presents a nuanced picture. A king attempting to navigate imperial domination, consolidate internal control, and secure the survival of his kingdom. Behind closed doors, however, Manasseh's obsession with occultism and power left a mark of terror and corruption that would echo long after his death, setting the stage for Judah's eventual confrontation with divine judgment and the collapse of its religious foundations. Captivity and the turning point. Despite his long reign and outward display of power, Manasseh's rule was not without consequence. At some point during his middle years, the Assyrian Empire, under an unknown campaign of enforcement or political intimidation, captured him and brought him in chains to Babylon, the great imperial capital far to the east of Judah. The Bible in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 verses 10 to 11 recounts that the Lord brought upon Manasseh the Assyrians to lead him away, a phrase that hints at divine judgment even in the midst of political realities. Historians suggest that this may have occurred circa 660 BCE to 655 BCE, during the waning years of Esarhaddon's reign or the early years of Ashurbanipal, when Assyria's hold over its vassals was strengthened by military campaigns and displays of royal authority. The capture of Manasseh was a moment that exposed the vulnerability of Judah, demonstrating that even a king of 55 years on the throne could be humbled by the empire's reach. The period of captivity was transformative. Away from Jerusalem, isolated in a foreign capital, Manasseh reportedly experienced profound remorse for his actions. The biblical chroniclers describe him praying to Yahweh and humbling himself before God in a way that was unprecedented for a king previously characterized as wholly corrupt. Scholars suggest that this period in Babylon, removed from his throne and stripped of political power, forced Manasseh to confront the consequences of decades of idolatry, child sacrifice, and occult practice. The psychological impact of exile, combined with the awe-inspiring might of the Assyrian state, may have prompted a reconsideration of both his political and spiritual decisions. While some historians debate the literal nature of the chronicler's account, the narrative serves as a pivotal turning point in Judah's history, marking the first acknowledgement of repentance by its darkest king. Upon his release from captivity, Manasseh returned to Jerusalem with a newfound, if cautious, reverence for Yahweh. The Bible in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 verse 12 reports that he rebuilt the city walls, restored the fortifications, and worked to consolidate his kingdom after the humiliation of Assyrian captivity. Archaeological evidence suggests that Jerusalem in the 7th century BCE saw extensive construction projects, including fortifications and palace repairs, which may coincide with the period following Manasseh's exile. These efforts demonstrated that he remained politically astute and capable of governance, even after having endured personal humiliation. Yet this outward restoration of the kingdom also reflected an inward shift, at least according to biblical authors, toward a reconciliation with God and acknowledgement of the errors that had plagued Judah during his early reign. Despite his apparent repentance, Manasseh's legacy remained complicated. While he restored some aspects of worship and removed foreign altars in Jerusalem, 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 12 warns that the Lord would bring calamity upon Judah because of Manasseh's prior sins, a prophetic indication that repentance could not erase decades of spiritual corruption. The people of Judah had already been deeply influenced by 55 years of idolatry and moral compromise. Religious reformers, priests, and prophets who witnessed his earlier acts may have viewed his repentance with skepticism, questioning whether a king capable of child sacrifice and defiling the temple could genuinely lead the nation back to covenant fidelity. Nevertheless, the chroniclers framed Manasseh's repentance as a moment of divine mercy, emphasizing that even the most sinful king could seek forgiveness and receive God's compassion. Historical accounts, outside the biblical texts, provide additional context for this period. Assyrian records indicate continued tribute and loyalty from Judah under Manasseh, suggesting that his return from Babylon did not diminish his role as a vassal king. Some scholars argue that the experience of captivity may have been leveraged to reinforce political obedience to Assyria, while simultaneously fostering a superficial religious reform in Jerusalem. The interplay between genuine spiritual repentance, political pragmatism, and survival strategy reflects the complex reality faced by Judah during the empire's dominance. Manasseh's actions after captivity suggest a king attempting to balance divine reconciliation with the practical demands of ruling a small kingdom under imperial control. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of Manasseh's exile had long-term implications for Judah. His repentance allowed him to re-establish some measure of religious authority, but it could not undo the entrenched idolatry among the people or the spiritual damage caused by decades of worship of foreign gods. This tension between political stability and spiritual fragility would shape Judah's destiny, as future kings inherited both the fortified city and the legacy of compromise. For the chroniclers, Manasseh's story became a cautionary tale. Even the most sinful and tyrannical rulers could seek redemption, but the consequences of their actions would echo through generations. In this way, Manasseh's exile and return symbolize both human frailty and divine mercy, a paradox that continues to intrigue historians, theologians, and readers of the biblical texts today. Manasseh's captivity was more than a political event. It was a turning point that reshaped his reign and left a complex legacy. The boy who became the darkest king of Judah returned as a humbled ruler, striving to restore the kingdom while contending with the long shadows of his prior sin. His story demonstrates the intertwining of political power, spiritual rebellion, and human vulnerability, revealing that even a king who once led his nation into profound darkness could experience repentance, survival, and partial restoration. Yet the imprint of his early reign remained, setting the stage for Judah's eventual struggles and the historical judgment that would follow in the centuries to come. The high places rebuilt and a nation corrupted. After his return from Assyrian captivity, Manasseh resumed his reign over Judah, but his repentance did not erase the religious structures and cultural patterns he had established in his earlier years. While the biblical chroniclers in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 verses 13 to 17 highlight his humility before God, they also record that the king continued to exert control over religious life in Judah, often in ways that reinforced the syncretism he had fostered. High places, once destroyed by Hezekiah, were rebuilt and repurposed as centers of worship for multiple deities, a practice that blurred the lines between covenant fidelity and idolatry. These high places, strategically located on hills and in remote valleys, allowed local communities to continue practices that had been outlawed, effectively normalizing ritualistic worship of foreign gods alongside the God of Israel. The persistence of these high places demonstrates that Manasseh's repentance was complex and perhaps pragmatic rather than absolute. Archaeologists studying the remains of cultic sites in Judah have noted evidence of continued ritual activity during the 7th century BCE, suggesting that the king tolerated or even encouraged local religious practices that incorporated elements of Assyrian astral worship, Baal worship, and Asherah veneration. Scholars argue that this approach may have been designed to stabilize his kingdom after decades of internal conflict and external pressure. By allowing these cults to persist under royal supervision, Manasseh maintained the loyalty of influential families and priests who had profited from the earlier religious infrastructure. This blending of politics and religion ensured that opposition to his rule remained minimal, even as it left the people of Judah spiritually compromised. Manasseh's court also became a hub for foreign religious influences during this period. Envoys, traders, and diplomats from Assyria and neighboring regions brought with them the rituals, symbols, and ideas of their homelands, many of which found their way into Jerusalem's temple precincts and the broader urban landscape. The king's own promotion of these practices further encouraged the assimilation of foreign cults into Judahite life. 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 3 highlights Manasseh's installation of altars to Baal, Asherah, and the host of heaven in Jerusalem, suggesting that these reforms were not confined to the countryside but deeply embedded in the capital. For many ordinary citizens, the experience of worship became increasingly confusing, as multiple gods and rituals competed for attention, and the once exclusive covenant with Yahweh was diluted by syncretism and royal endorsement of foreign deities. In addition to religious influence, Manasseh's rule had social and psychological implications for Judah. Prophets and teachers who had survived his earlier reign may have viewed the continued high places and idolatry with apprehension, recognizing that decades of exposure to such practices would shape the moral and spiritual framework of future generations. Parents and elders, once confident in the exclusive worship of Yahweh, now witnessed their children participating in ceremonies that involved divination, astral worship, and rituals previously condemned. The chroniclers' repeated condemnation of Manasseh's reign as more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites underscores the profound cultural shift that occurred under his leadership and the sense of communal guilt and anxiety that accompanied it. Yet Manasseh's approach was not solely destructive. It was also politically calculated. By controlling both religious infrastructure and the loyalty of local elites, the king maintained centralized authority over Judah, ensuring that no faction could rise in open rebellion. Fortifications around Jerusalem were rebuilt, including walls and gates, and economic stability was preserved through tributes and trade facilitated under Assyrian oversight. In this sense, Manasseh exemplifies the duality of leadership in the ancient world. A ruler capable of maintaining order and protecting his kingdom while simultaneously eroding its spiritual and cultural foundations. His reign demonstrates that political survival often required compromises that had long-term consequences for national identity. Historians have noted that Manasseh's policies created a tension between survival and sin, as he attempted to navigate the geopolitical realities of his time, while engaging in practices that violated the covenantal laws of Israel. The king's tolerance of high places and foreign worship did not signify indifference to Yahweh, but rather a complex strategy in which personal devotion, political necessity, and public image intersected. The chroniclers framed his actions as an abomination, yet modern scholarship acknowledges that kings of small states under imperial domination frequently had to balance competing religious and political demands. Manasseh's long reign allowed these compromises to take root in Judahite society, shaping religious culture in ways that would persist for decades. The rebuilding of high places under Manasseh cemented his reputation as Judah's most controversial king. While he may have demonstrated personal repentance after captivity, his policies enabled a generation of Judahites to grow accustomed to a form of worship that was both syncretistic and idolatrous. By intertwining political authority with religious tolerance of foreign gods, he created a kingdom that was stable in the short term, but spiritually fragile in the long term. For historians and theologians alike, this period of Manasseh's reign offers a sobering lesson in how power, pragmatism, and moral compromise can shape the destiny of a nation, leaving consequences that echo long after the king himself has passed from the throne. The legacy of darkness and Judah's decline. Manasseh's long reign came to an end, circa 642 BCE, leaving behind a kingdom that was politically stable but spiritually fractured. His son Amon succeeded him on the throne at the age of 22, inheriting a nation deeply influenced by 55 years of idolatry, occult practices, and ritual corruption. The biblical chroniclers emphasize that the people of Judah continued in the sinful patterns established under Manasseh, and the warnings of the prophets went largely unheeded. The high places remained active, foreign gods were worshipped alongside Yahweh, and the moral fabric of society had been eroded by decades of royal endorsement of practices that had long been forbidden under the law of Moses. For the people who had witnessed Manasseh's reign firsthand, the transition to Amon's rule may have seemed like a continuation of spiritual chaos rather than a new beginning. Manasseh's legacy was also political. Despite the moral collapse, Judah had survived the volatile pressures of the Assyrian Empire, maintaining its borders and avoiding the destruction that had befallen the northern kingdom of Israel, circa 722 BCE. His policies of submission, tribute, and strategic alliance with Assyria ensured that Jerusalem remained intact and its monarchy intact. Assyrian inscriptions such as the Esarhaddon prism attest to Manasseh's role as a loyal vassal, confirming the biblical record that the king paid tribute and contributed to imperial building projects. In this sense, Manasseh's long reign provided a rare period of stability, but it came at the cost of national identity and spiritual fidelity. His political acumen could not erase the decades of moral compromise that would haunt his successors. The social consequences of Manasseh's reign were profound. Ordinary citizens had grown accustomed to participating in high-place rituals, astral worship, and divination, practices that were once foreign and forbidden. Families were divided between those who remained loyal to Yahweh and those who embraced the king's policies, creating a tension that would shape Judahite society for generations. Prophets and priests who survived his reign likely witnessed this moral disorientation with despair, knowing that the patterns of idolatry and corruption were deeply entrenched. The biblical writers frame Manasseh's reign as a period of national trauma, emphasizing the scale of sin and the long-term consequences for Judah's spiritual life. Historians have noted that Manasseh's approach to governance reflected a complex interplay between pragmatism and moral compromise. By tolerating or encouraging idolatry, he secured the loyalty of powerful families and priests, maintained political stability, and avoided direct confrontation with Assyria. Yet these decisions undermined the covenantal identity of Judah and left a spiritual void that would have ramifications for his successors. Manasseh's reign illustrates the paradox of power in the ancient Near East. A ruler could achieve external security while simultaneously fostering internal decay. For scholars, this duality highlights the tension between survival and morality, illustrating how long-term consequences often outweighed immediate benefits. The death of Manasseh did not immediately reverse the spiritual decline he had fostered. His son Amon continued in the idolatrous practices of his father, and the people remained influenced by decades of syncretism and ritualized corruption. 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 19 emphasizes that Amon did evil in the sight of the Lord, as Manasseh his father had done, reflecting how deeply Manasseh's legacy had taken root. The prophetic warnings issued during his reign became prophetic reality, as Judah teetered on the edge of judgment, eventually culminating in the Babylonian exile decades later. Manasseh's actions had set in motion a chain of events that would shape the nation's history, demonstrating the enduring impact of a king's moral and spiritual choices. Theologically, Manasseh became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, moral corruption, and the seductive allure of idolatry. Biblical authors framed his life as a cautionary tale. Even a king of Davidic lineage, chosen by God, could fall into profound sin and lead an entire nation astray. Yet his story also contains an element of divine mercy, as his repentance following Assyrian captivity reveals the possibility of redemption even for the most sinful ruler. This duality, the coexistence of judgment and mercy, corruption and repentance, makes Manasseh a compelling figure in the biblical narrative, illustrating the complex dynamics of leadership, faith, and human weakness. Manasseh's reign left Judah in a precarious position. Politically secure and externally stable, the nation was spiritually vulnerable and morally compromised. The high places remained, foreign gods were worshipped, and the people had grown accustomed to practices that defied the covenant of their ancestors. His 55-year reign was both a testament to his political skill and a warning of the consequences of moral compromise, a period in which a nation could survive wars and empires, but still be imperiled by the decay of its own soul. For historians, theologians, and readers of the biblical texts, Manasseh embodies the paradox of power. Long life, stability, and political success can coexist with spiritual ruin and ethical collapse.